Kia ora everyone, this is Anderson's Odyssey. I'm Jacob Anderson and my guest today is Rochelle Constantine. Rochelle's a Blake leader and an associate professor at the University of Auckland in the Marine Mammal Ecology Group. How are you going, Rochelle? Now, when people think of carbon storage, they often think of trees or they think of the land, but the ocean plays a really important role in carbon storage as well. What are some of the processes, or what are some of the things that happen in the ocean at a large scale that drive a lot of that carbon movement?
I think one of the things we humans forget, we're very terrestrial beasties, and we forget that our planet is 70% ocean for a start. And one of the most important organisms on our planet, or collective of organisms, are the phytoplankton. So they're the beginning of the food chain in the ocean, and they collectively are responsible for more than every second breath you take. So if you try and sort of only take every second breath that you would normally take, you don't last for too long. So you have to thank the phytoplankton a lot for that. But importantly, they're actually really important in atmospheric oxygen, carbon dioxide movement. So they produce oxygen, which is what we breathe, but they also absorb carbon and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there's about 50 times more carbon dioxide stored in the ocean than is actually stored in our atmosphere. And it's not just for phytoplankton, that's all of the marine organisms. So the oceans are really important places for lots of reasons that allow our planet to function. Some recent analysis showed that just a 1% increase in phytoplankton would be the equivalent to over 2 billion mature trees being planted. So that's insane. Like, there's just 1% increase in phytoplankton. So we often, think about, forests and trees and the terrestrial, photosynthesizing things being really important, and they are. I'm not saying they're not, but in the oceans, it's very important that these systems function properly.
You mentioned this, that 1% increase in phytoplankton. How can we, or what are some of the processes, I suppose, that would see an increase in phytoplankton in our oceans? Because we can't, in the same way we can't go out and plant them like we can plant trees, for example.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky understanding exactly how these processes work. So of course, phytoplankton are photosynthesizing. So they're in the very surface, mostly within the top tens of meters of our ocean. You don't find them down in the depths where it's dark. And so they need to be near sources of light. But they also rely on macronutrients and micronutrients. So these are basically chemicals within the ocean system that make it function. And so that sort of ocean biogeochemistry is really important, and it creates different levels of productivity in different places. So nitrogen is a very important thing in our oceans. So some of the nutrients come off land, erosion of nutrients through rocks or windblown dust particles, all kinds of different things. But when you're way far out in the ocean and not near land, those systems can alter a little bit. And so the movement or the production of nitrogen within systems is really important. And for many organisms, including the phytoplankton, that's kind of the major macronutrient. In some systems, micronutrients in particular in our oceans come from iron, things like the selenium, iron, a number of these. And one of the areas that has been really intensely looked at in recent years is the Southern Ocean. And that area is very low in iron. And iron is really important for phytoplankton productivity. And there's been some quite fascinating work that was undertaken sort of mainly throughout the 90s and then sort of, early mid 2000s, looking at iron seeding. If we put iron into the ocean, could we stimulate phytoplankton productivity? And if we did that, would that then mean we had a way of, absorbing more carbon dioxide from the system? So you increase productivity in the sea, which is good because for zooplankton that feed on phytoplankton, and then the fish that feed on them, and so on and so on. But also as a way of dealing with, some of our climate change issues and trying to deal with, carbon dioxide. One of the things that came out of that is, yeah, sure, we can chuck iron in the ocean, in the Southern Ocean, and boom, you get this boom of phytoplankton, and then, presumably a boom in zooplankton that comes immediately after that. But what they also found, and have worked out, colleagues in particular based over in Tasmania have worked a lot on this, is looking at the levels of iron in whale poo. And the reason for that is that they were really interested in when we undertook, basically wholesale slaughter of our large whales throughout the world's oceans, mostly during the 1900s. What was the role in whales in producing nutrients and having this sort of energy flow within systems in the Southern Ocean? And I guess to pair it back to the phytoplankton and the sort of productivity, what they found is when you look at whale poo, it's 10 million times higher in iron than the background water levels in the Southern Ocean. So whale poo is filled with iron, and that they get that from eating krill. So the whales down in the Southern Ocean, the big baleen whales, so the blue whales, humpbacks, fin whales, those filter feeding whales, they actually consume massive amounts of krill down in the Southern Ocean. And the krill eat phytoplankton, but the iron that's in the phytoplankton when it grows gets locked up in the bodies of the krill. And because the whales are eating so much krill, when they poop it out, it actually breaks down the krill carapaces, the bodies of the krill, and then it actually pushes it back out into the system. And that's why the iron levels are so high. So this started off a whole big conversation about the role of whales in ecosystem functioning.
Yeah, so instead of, say, geoengineering the ocean, which would also have other unforeseen risks because we're adding something into the system, effectively what you're saying is whales, the high iron in whale poo creates this phytoplankton bloom, which then can draw down carbon and is a far more efficient tool than some of these other means that we may have been trying to think about.
Yeah. So, it's sort of, nature had it all sorted before we came along and totally ruined it. Globally, in excess of 3 million whales were killed, and well in excess actually. In the Southern Ocean alone, I think it was about 2.3 million whales were killed in sort of mainly the Southern Ocean, the Southern Hemisphere, but that was primarily down in Antarctic waters, which is insane. It was just wholesale slaughter. And you can imagine, like, these large whales, they live to be about 60 to 80 years of age. So in by whale life terms, in a very short space of time, we completely altered the system function by basically taking out one of the biggest, most important contributors to that ecosystem function in the Southern Ocean. But, it's not just there. Whales seed nitrogen into the environment wherever they go, through really high levels of nitrogen within their urea, their urine, and they're always excreting that. So always, whenever they need to wee, basically. But so it's not just iron, which is a particular feature of the Southern Ocean. Not all oceans are iron limited. It was just more the Southern Ocean system that got studied and paid attention to. But also, I think it stopped us in our tracks and started thinking about the role of whales in general within ocean ecosystems and those sort of energy flows and locking up of carbon and actually making systems work properly. So that has led to some more interesting discussions. And in 2010, actually, Aaron Pershing and colleagues wrote this really cool paper about whales as a source of carbon dioxide, of carbon sequestration. So whales are huge. They're I don't know, depends on the size, but an average whale is probably about 30-ish 30, 40 tons in weight, you know, so they're really big animals, and they live a very long time. So within, you know, in their muscles and skeletons and their whole body, their blubber and everything, all of that's carbon. It's all locked up into this giant animal. So every time it feeds, it's taking carbon in, and it's using some of that and energy to survive. But when that whale dies, it actually locks up carbon within its body. And so Pershing did this really neat analysis looking at large animals, and he focused mostly on the whales, but this also holds for, you know, fish and seals and, you know, big animals, because they're metabolically quite efficient and they live a long time, so they lock up more carbon over the course of their lives. And he worked out that sort of pre-whaling, there was a blue whale, you know, the blue whale populations would lock up or export about 72,000 tons of carbon per year within just the blue whales alone. And today it's only around about 1,000. So, you know, we've gone, by killing all these whales, we've taken their role as, you know, as sort of moving energy through systems from really enormous amounts, you know, 72,000 tons of carbon per year down to about 1,000 is now, and this is about 50 years after they've been protected. As you know, that's insane. It's just such a massive shift. So there was, you know, a lot of discussion around this of well, what are the role then? What have we lost? What have we done by killing these really big animals in carbon flows within systems? And so just recently, some economists from the International Monetary Fund basically turned this science, you know, our kind of carbon science around whales into money, the dollar value of that. And they were really interested in how much was a whale worth as a carbon dioxide sequestration item. And they worked out at about 33 tons of carbon dioxide per whale sequestered in each whale. So that's 33 tons, which is an insane amount of carbon dioxide. And when they looked back at, you know, at the amount of carbon that, you know, is locked up in forests and in systems like that, what they found is that, you know, if the whale populations were fully recovered, it would be about 1.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year just in the whales. And it's so much, you know, compared to forests. Yeah.
That seems like an amazing way to kind of restore or store carbon, but whales, they grow very slowly, and it would take a long time to bring a population back from, you know, to have 3 million whales back into the population. So that has got some limitations, doesn't it? We can't kind of do that overnight like we would plant trees. What can we do to, or what sort of health are the whales in at the moment? Are they recovering? Are they in decline? Or what does that look like compared to the pre-whaling days?
Well, they are recovering by and large. You know, almost all populations of whales are on the mend. You know, like for blue whales, for example, over 99% of the blue whales in the southern hemisphere were exterminated through whaling. Most of the large whale populations got down to easy less than 10% of their pre-exploitation numbers. We did a really good job at killing whales. Some of the stocks or populations have recovered. Grey whales, are sort of along the Pacific coast of North America have done really well. Humpback whales on both coasts of Australia have recovered pretty well. Large parts of the US. So there are, you know, a number of you know, species that are making a comeback. There are still some really worrying signs. For example, blue whales in the southern hemisphere, The estimates certainly sort of less than 10% of their pre-whaling numbers. They're very slow to recover. Fin whales also quite slow. So it's variable in different places. And there's been quite a lot of, discussion about, why we might see that difference, and why do some populations recover faster than others. And, we don't know whether for the species like blue whales that maybe it's loss of cultural information. Maybe it's loss of knowledge about how to find other whales and breed. Maybe it's genetic, they've gone through a genetic bottleneck, which we know doesn't happen instantly with these long-lived, slow breeding species. Sometimes it's a few generations later that you actually will see the genetic bottleneck. And that there might be something in that for the Antarctic blue whales, where for some reason they're just not recovering for genetic reasons. The challenge is that these whales are really hard to find, and they happen to be in, really some of the most inhospitable oceans in the world. The Southern Ocean, you just don't pop there and collect some data. And these whales don't aggregate in big numbers. Like humpback whales are a really great example. So humpback whales, they swim up to the Pacific Islands, and you can go and see them off Tonga, or you can see them off, Samoa, or wherever you might go, because that's where they go. They come together in gregarious large breeding aggregations. But for things like blue whales, they don't seem to aggregate in a really predictable way. And where we can just go to this place and find them. And that was what was quite exciting this year. Some work in the South Georgia, where they were actually working on the right whales, the southern right whales. They found a whole bunch of Antarctic blue whales there. So they're like, whoa, what's this? One thing that we do know is that a lot of the whale populations are really dependent on prey. So where prey availability is. And this sort of comes back to some of the challenges with climate change. So we end up with some really tangled messes, because, in a perfect world, we would stop killing whales. They would migrate to the Southern Ocean, or at least in our neck of the woods, they'd migrate to, these Antarctic waters. There would be lots of krill there, and they would feed on it, and then they would just migrate north. Or for the Northern Hemisphere, they would migrate to the sort of more Arctic waters, or they would feed on fishes, big schooling fishes, capelin, herring, things like that, and then they would migrate down to, their breeding grounds. And that, that works really nice, except for we've overfished a lot of our oceans. A really good example is off the New England coast, humpback whales that used to feed a lot on capelin. When the capelin stocks collapsed, they just completely changed their prey. So they've shifted to sandlance, and they had to totally change their feeding behavior and everything. North Atlantic right whales, another example. The really predictable aggregations of copepods that they favored were all in these particular places. They made lots of laws to make sure they didn't get hit by ships, which was, really important, and was a major contributor to mortality. And what happens, a few years ago, where are the whales? They're just not there. And what's happened is the copepods have moved. Why? Because the climate change impacts on the Arctic systems have been so enormous that the food is not where it should be. And if the food's not where it should be, then these whales aren't where they should be. So in the Southern Ocean, we don't really know, it's really hard to get an idea of what the impact of climate change is, but we know it's probably not zero. So how the Southern Ocean system works is in the winterish, winter months, broadly speaking, there's lots of ice. It freezes out, and the phytoplankton sit underneath it. It's dark, so they're not photosynthesizing, and they just sit under the ice and they wait until the light comes around broader summer months. Then the ice melts, it warms up, the ice melts, the phytoplankton are released into the water, the zooplankton feeds the krill, there's this big bloom. That's when the whales arrive, yum, 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 they eat all of that krill. And that's how it works in a perfect system. But how does that go when the freeze-thaw cycle is altered? Now, particularly around the broader Antarctic Peninsula region, the Bellingshausen and Amundsen Sea, which is kind of due south, roughly, of French Polynesia, and sort of that way. So really remote waters there. That area, there's very little ice now, and it's not freezing as much as it used to. And the humpback whales of Oceania, the ones that migrate past New Zealand on their way south in particular, those whales, a lot of them are going down to that Bellingshausen Amundsen Sea region. So when they get there, if there hasn't been enough ice, which means no place for phytoplankton to shelter. Maybe there's not enough phytoplankton, which means there's not enough zooplankton. When the whales arrive, is there enough food to feed them all? We don't know this. We actually have no idea how the system's going. So it may be that some population recovery is being suppressed because of shifts in productivity cycles. And that's, boy, it's such a tough thing for us to get our heads around as scientists.
You've done some work with the humpbacks in tracking their migration, and there's been different some of these populations have taken different paths, and that has had other impacts on those populations. Why is that, or what's the reason behind some of that different migration?
Yeah, it's a good question. Humpback whales in particular they're a really social whale. So most large baleen whales are pretty antisocial. They don't really feed together. They don't hang out together much. They might come together and mate, and like the Bruders whales in the Hauraki Gulf, you virtually never see a bunch of them hanging out. You know, they clearly come together because every now and then there's a Bruders whale baby, but you know, you don't see these kind of big social aggregations like you do with humpbacks. And I think one of the things that's really important for humpbacks is to be hanging out with other humpback whales. And we also know within humpbacks, there's a lot of cultural transmission of information, so transferal of information. So these whales that undertake these very long migrations, the calf is born in the warmer waters in the tropics, then swims with its mum down to the cooler Antarctic waters, and then swims back to the tropics. And then usually it's kind of done after about 1.5 years, max 2 years of hanging out with mum. The whale's on its own, even though it's not sexually mature, it's kind of does its own thing, and it's learned where to go. And we think that for the whales that are coming from Oceania, coming past Roll Island, that they have no land barriers other than Australia, maybe New Zealand. All the way across to Chile, there's nothing. They can go wherever they want to go. And they've learned to swim to this Amundsen, Bellingshausen Sea region for their, when they're in a non-reproductive stage of life. So probably a lot of juveniles down there, but also very few mothers and calves go there. But the mothers with calves go straight down to the Ross Sea region, but they don't go right into the Ross Sea area, which is where, you know, New Zealand has its base, and we see minke whales and all kinds of things. And they actually stay a reasonable way north of it, and that's where mums and calves stop, and they feed. And there's no land, there's nothing, there's no ice out there, and they just stop at this spot. My student Lena Ricola did a study on, you know, what were the differences in energetics. You know, if you have to swim, because the whales go to Amundsen, Bellingshausen Sea, it's swimming, I think it's about 4,000 kilometers more in some cases than the mums swimming with their calves straight down. And we think that what's happening is mums are slowed down by their calf. She also has to produce energy for her to maintain the swim back to Antarctica, but also feed her calf as well. So the mums probably have, you know, a more tight energetic budget and time budget because they have to swim a little bit slower, whereas the others can go a little bit faster, get to these feeding grounds and find enough prey. So I think that there's this sort of fine balance depending on their phase of life, that because south of the South Pacific is just big open ocean, they learn where to go to get whatever food that they require, which is pretty cool. You know, because it's huge. I think it's something like a 4,000 kilometer expanse between, you know, the Ross Sea area and then across to the Bellingshausen Sea area where these whales were feeding. And they all originated, you know, where we tagged them was at Roll Island in the Kermadec, this tiny little island. So they know their way around these whales, you know. And I think that's what brings back, you know, sort of thinking about their role in these ecosystems functioning properly. You know, that kind of, you know, there's two kind of things. There's the whale pump, and then there's called the whale conveyor belt. And the whale pump is when they're feeding and they're eating whatever they're eating. They come to the surface to breathe in that. We know that they poop at the surface. They poop deeper down as well. But whatever they're eating, all of those nutrients that come with that whale poo, all of that nitrogen and carbon and energy that just comes out in their poo sits in that system, and it's fed on by all kinds of things. Lots of things eat whale poo. Whale poo is just manna from heaven for many, many organisms in the sea. And so those whales are kind of moving these nutrients through the system. And then when the whales, like migrating whales, move from the Southern Ocean and migrate to the tropics, they stop pooing pretty quickly because they've finished feeding. They don't feed once they leave, Southern Ocean, but they are producing nitrogenous waste. They are, urinating. And as they move north, they're seeding this nitrogen as they go north. So the role of whales in these well-trodden migration paths, which is, the conveyor belt of energy, or within the system that they're in, that sort of whale pump where their role within that system, seeding nutrients into it that in turn produce krill for them that they eat, and so on and so on. I mean, they're just really neat things for us, I think, to get our heads around of how these systems work so well and how quickly we can really destroy them. So, I'm optimistic that whale populations will recover. Would we get back to the estimated 5 million or so that we used to have? I really don't know. I mean, maybe in X hundreds of years, but if we don't get our contribution to, carbon dioxide being released into our atmosphere, I don't know how well these whales will do. I think some of them will do well, those that have plasticity in their behavior, so those that adapt and will shift where they go and what they feed on and those kinds of things. Humpbacks being quite a good example of that. Brooder's whales is another example. But maybe if some of these are fixed, it might not be so good.
I'm not sure if you told me this or somebody else told me, but they have a memory where they go back home to breed, don't they? So a whale will only go and breed in the same, I think, is it the southern rights or the humpbacks? They'll only breed in the same harbour where they were born or where they grew up. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a few different species of whales that do that. Yeah, we call it natal site fidelity. So you return to the place you were born. And we can see that in their genetics, we can see that. And we think it's a learned behaviour. It's what the whales learn to do. We also know that some whales will bust a move and go somewhere else every now and then as well. But you can see it really strongly in the genetic signatures. Southern right whales, humpback whales being, really good examples of that, where, they actually, they return to this place that they came from. And that's why, I think when we're thinking about, how do we protect whales? Just recently, the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is an UN body, they've actually finally recognised culture as a very important part of whales' lives. Sperm whales also have a magnificent, rich culture, and they learn a lot. They have a really long period of dependency on their mum, and they learn a lot from their mums in that time, and they have unique ways of communicating, as do humpbacks, bowhead whales as well. And so it seems for some of the really big whales, they have very rich, complex memories and cultural knowledge. And so when we really, it's not like if we outfish an area, or if there's just, there's no ice and so there's no phytoplankton, there's no krill, for example, that, oh, well, the whales, they're big, they'll just swim somewhere else. They might actually not be able to adapt and do that. So I was really pleased when culture was recognised as a really important component in conservation action, and thinking about how we protect animals and why. And for a lot of the great whales, some of the things that are threatening them, for example, ship strike, which is a huge problem in some parts of the world, entanglement still in fishing gear, less and less direct hunting, but in some places, direct hunting. One of the things that I think it's an interesting thought experiment to do is, if we value whales as carbon sinks, as carbon sequestration mechanisms, and they were sort of valued, that IMF analysis I was just talking about, valued each whale at about $3.5 million New Zealand dollars per living whale, which is a lot of money. A whale's worth a lot of money when you put it in carbon dioxide terms. But that value shifts of that whale as the price of carbon shifts, right? So there was an IMF proposal recently of putting a carbon tax of about 100 New Zealand dollars, and that would make whales worth about $8 million each. So much like we do with the trees, if you plant trees, you lock up a forest, you get some carbon credits, or you get some value from that. Perhaps we think about whales in those terms. And so maybe there's a way of going back and looking at places either where direct hunting is occurring, where it doesn't need to occur. I'm talking about non-indigenous takes here, mostly Japan. They're pretty much the only ones that are still really doing it. But, if you could go, if somehow the world, through the UN, through the IMF, all these other sort of, big agreements that we have, go to them and say, you know what? Every whale that you keep alive is worth this much, and let's make it worth your while. Same for shipping industries. Okay, shipping, you worked really hard to not hit and kill whales. You've either rerouted your traffic or slowed down, as we've done in the Hauraki Gulf. We're going to reward you for that. You're going to be able to claim a carbon credit because of your action to save whales. And when these whales are worth a lot more than trees, they really are, like the carbon sequestration of them is just immense, then, that's an interesting conversation to have. I as a biologist, I it's kind of like, oh yeah, you don't really think about whales as money terms, but as a conservation scientist, I'm like, well, if that's what it takes, because we're paying to plant trees, or to protect forests, or to protect native forests, not chop it down. There's that red countries that preserve forests, get sort of benefits for that, and there's mechanisms for doing that. Maybe we need to think about that for the oceans, for the big things in the oceans.
Yeah, the potential and the storage is a pretty amazing kind of way to think about the role that the whales play.
Yeah.
As well as that, when they die, they effectively become this smorgasbord that turns into, I've seen video, these deep sea submersibles, they show this whale carcass and the life that this sort of barren deep sea environment just comes alive, and all sorts of other animals appear and start feeding on that. I mean, that must have a huge role in a lot of those deep sea animals. Do they depend on whales dying, or do they feed on other things, or what does that look like?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's so, this is a whole other conversation again, really. But, not just are the whales, living and doing all of their thing and functioning within the system when they're alive, but when they die and they sink to the ocean depths, sure, they sequester the carbon, but they then become a place where a whole ecosystem sets up for many, many years. And you can look it up, there's some really cool whale fall footage. So, just as you said, look it up on the internet. There's some really neat stuff. And these deep sea submersibles are filming these whales. Some of them they've deliberately sunk and actually monitored to see what's going on. And others, they've just come across. But what they've found is there is well in excess of 100 different species of organism, largish organism, that's not counting the bacteria and all the microbial things, that only live around whale fall, around these decaying whale carcasses. And they're responsible for actually the breakdown of this carcass. And so these become places where there's crabs and fish and worms and lobsters and eels. There's this really wonderful one of I can't remember it's an eel anyway, and it ties itself into a knot. It sort of latches onto the whale and ties its body into a knot and pulls itself off, creates some leverage, and it takes a big chunk out of the whale. It's amazing. My favorite one is this worm called Osydax muciflorus, which means bone-eating snot flower. And it's a worm that only lives on whale carcasses, and it doesn't even have a digestive system. It just absorbs, it leaches fat, and it sort of breaks it down through this sort of beneficial relationship with bacteria. So there's some amazing life, really big to really small, that sort of sets up around whale fall. And like I said, it takes decades for that to be all broken down, but all of that rich energy. And so you can imagine, when we killed, over 3 million whales, that was 3 million whales that would have died naturally at whatever stage of their life, as either as a calf or as an old whale, that would have, historically dropped to the seabed. So, what has our benthic ecosystems lost? what rich biodiversity in those species that live just off whale fall, what was lost there? And then that nutrient flow that goes on within benthic systems that we know are hugely productive. You know, so there's so much lost when we overdo it, you know, when we hunt too much, we take too much out of the oceans, when we alter this, you know, the functioning of oceans. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, you know, with that iron seeding experiment, you know, whilst it was interesting, it was looking at a technical solution to a problem we've created, but actually it probably would have had some other, you know, flow-on effect. Same with carbon sequestration, you know, in the deep sea. You know, they're all interesting ideas, and I think we need to discuss all ideas to try and deal with this, you know, this really giant elephant in the room, which is climate change. But, you know, sometimes just going back to nature and actually looking at how systems function, and when we leave them and they function well, that, you know, how can we be part of this, you know, within it instead of alongside it. And, you know, yeah, some of this work that we've talked about today, it just blows my mind. And I love pulling all of these little threads together, you know, economics and conservation and just basic whale science and biogeochemistry, and it's just so neat.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to kind of sum it all up and really kind of illustrate the importance of the phytoplankton and the relationship that they have with the whales, and how they then store all of this carbon, but then also provide all of these amazing ecosystem services. And then, you know, it would be fantastic if we could start to explore the credit or the blue carbon value of whales. And I know there is some work in that space for kelp and other things, but I mean, that would be an amazing addition to help this recovery and help share the really amazing services that they can provide, and get people beyond thinking about trees and land-based solutions and how the ocean can really help us. So thanks so much for sharing all of these amazing insights, Rochelle.
Oh, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, thanks for asking me along. It's always nice talking about this stuff. It's a fun topic, and it's one that's not static. You know, we're always learning more. So yeah, look back to nature. It often holds the answers that we need. So yeah.
Yeah, nature-based solutions, they're definitely a really valuable tool.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.